Anyway, he's being ratioed to death. It's for those who know Twitter, he's being attacked vociferously, which is appropriate, and but it's bringing out all the anti-Semites. And of course, the question is,
who's being attacked?
And do you think Muslims in New York, there isn't a single madrasa that isn't?
You mean they're as crazy as we are?
Whatever.
No, actually not. See, they
doing something stupid.
They value death, so they're just with the program. But it actually dovetails with their agenda. Like us, it's a clash to our agenda. Okay, today we have a packed day. There's tons of stuff going on. So let's turn on the recording first, and then we'll.
I got it, Yossi. Yossi, I looked after it.
So then you've done a lot. Sponsors.
Yeah, right. You've done a lot, and I appreciate you doing all the technicalities. It's not your job.
And you have enough of my mistakes, and now you want it to be done right. I'm with you all the way.
You were too good.
Please tell us about the sponsors for today.
No, you were too good. I'm worried about my job. I have a union job. You can't do this. But sponsors for today is the Gans family, Leila Nishmas, Rav Herschel, Rav Moshe Gans. His yard site is tomorrow. And by the Lieberson family is a Shevach Vaidah to the Rebbeinu Shalom. They tune into the programs regularly, but I really want to make sure that I announce them tonight and for Sounds Like Shabbos.
You got my message from the Rebbetzin?
Yes, that's Friday, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And did you convey to Jackie Gans that this broadcast is only like an Asham Tali? It only works until he could serve a good tikkun again.
Yeah, that's what he said. He didn't want to even do a pseudo tikkun and a pseudo siyum. Heshi Bullman arranged that all the mishnayos should be finished. We felt as Akar Satay for the breakfast, we should do a siyum mishnayos for his father. And he had it all lined up. So we were going to do the siyum anyway. He said, no, he wants to wait till it reopens. So maybe I think Moshe Zombek is worrying about home delivery for OJ and cheesecake and scrambled eggs. Put in your order for blintzes in advance. So.
Okay. So today is Chav He'ir, and I forgot to mention Shia Chechachevsky sent me a very nice text. He calls me. I ask him to call me from time to time to share with me. He always has great insights on the daf. So he said that Rabbi Yashiv said that somebody asked yesterday, why couldn't it just say 40? Why did it have to say Arbaim? Why couldn't the Mishnah say 39 malachos? Why did it say Arbaim Chasarachas? I think Dovi asked that question. And Tosfos Yom speaks about it, but he quoted from Rabbi Yashiv Shia Chechachevsky that if you said Hayoim Arbaim Chasarachas Yom Loimer, that would be 100% valid for Spheres Omer. So that's what she shared with us yesterday. I forgot to mention it. So today is the 40th day of the Omer. It's Chav He'ir, and there's actually a very significant yahrzeit. The famous Nesivos HaMishpat, Reb Yaakov Loberbaum of Lisa, who lived from 1760 to 1832. So he lived 72 years. But he's a famous Rav of Lisa, the Lisa Rav. His yahrzeit is today, and his name was Yaakov ben Yaakov. How did he come to get the name Yaakov ben Yaakov? Because at his bris, his father was so orangutan on learning that when the Moel asked for the baby's name, he didn't chap, and he thought the Moel was asking for his name, so he said Yaakov. So because of that, his name was Yaakov ben Yaakov, and he was an Einikol Chacham Tzvi, who we're going to speak a little bit about today. We're going to learn a little bit from Chacham Tzvi today. And another very interesting thing about the Nesivos was he was a Moridika Onav. When he got the job as Rav and Lisa, a balabos came to Shmuz and learning with him. And this balabos manufactured tar for a living. So it was considered, he wasn't a lawyer or a doctor, he was like a low-level balabos, so to speak. And he was such a massive Talmud Chacham that the Nesivos said, if your tar producers could learn like this, you don't need me as a Rav. And he wanted to quit. And it took some convincing to explain to him that not all of the balavatim in the city were as big Talmud Chacham as that particular balabos. So he should stay because they needed him. And the other nice tidbit about him is there's a famous rabbi that we know, the The Kotzker Rebbe used to refer to the Nesivos HaMishpat as the Zisa Lamden. He was the Rebbe of Lisa, but I guess he called him the Zisa Lamden. He liked him very much. And there's a lot of other interesting things about him, but it's his yahrzeit today. Okay, so today we have a very big task to go through some other malachas. So yesterday we went through some of the malachas as well. We went through the malacha. We analyzed a little bit the malacha of weaving. Now the Gemara is going to get back in to other malachas. So we're discussing primarily boirer. So the boirer that's in the Torah, is talking about after you do the winnowing and you have the little grains of wheat. There's still some soil.
I think we all saw that coming.
Akiva, is there a 6-minute delay or what?
No, he has a bad connection.
Akiva, you're muted.
Yeah, what happened?
He
Does
was,
it have
you-
to-
yeah, you saw him faltering. His video hasn't moved in a little bit.
Yeah, but his sound was going through.
Yeah, no, but
Okay.
he-
He's gonna try to log in.
He's still using the neighbor's Wi-Fi.
The
Yeah, he's
neighbor's
gonna
kids
come. He's
are
gonna log back in. There he is.
There he is.
I got cut out for a second.
Yossi, was that really you, the first part, or do you have already a twin that you said it earlier?
He's
'Cause
already
he sounded,
halfway.
it was amazing.
He's already halfway through the ovens.
Okay, I'm not sure how long I went missing for.
You just started talking about butter.
Okay. I wanted to learn the Tom of the Mishnah Berurah before we start learning the Gemara of Boyer, because that clarifies. It'll show us how to pull out, how to extract the right information from the Gemara as we learn it. So I'm not sure if anybody could see what I'm pointing to. I'm pointing to the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Shin Yutes. We should not pronounce that, but it's Shin Yutes, and there's a hakdama that the Mishnah Berurah gives to Hilchos Boyer. Hine Boyer hu echad milametes malachos shel Shabbos. Boyer is one of the 39 malachos on Shabbos. V'alkein, I'm sorry. The chayoven aleh gamkein chatos b'shoigig umisa b'mezid. It's a serious violation of Shabbos, and therefore you would have to bring a korban chatos if you were over it b'shoigig, and misa if you were over it b'mezid. Kemoy al shar malachos, just like other malachos. Ubavoid tzenu harabim harbe nichsholim harbe anoshim nichsholim be'isur boyer. Many people are nichshol in the isur of boyer because it's a little bit difficult to understand. That's why I want to explain it with all its details. Therefore, before we start learning the Shulchan Aruch, says the Chofetz Chaim, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a hakdama. Who? Ein chal isur boyer min the Torah. Isur boyer min the Torah is only relevant in one of three ways. So the first clue that the Mishnah Berurah gives us is the parameters as to what is considered boyer and what not has to do with how boyer is normally done. When people are
Has this happened in the last few days? There he is.
One day.
This is the quietest you ever get, Jesse.
Can you test this sheet, by the way? So it should be good. Or shite.
Should we have him call in, use the phone component? There he is.
Can you hear me again? I keep on cutting out. It's my internet access, but my computer's automatically going from provider to provider to try to find a stable provider. So let me get back into our Mishnah Berurah. I'm not sure at what point you weren't able to hear me, but the first dairaisa, of boyer is if you took the psolos out of the oichel. So you took what you didn't want away, and you left there what you want. Then it's also midairaisa. Afilu boyer biyadoi, even if you're doing it with hands and you're not using a special tool to help you sort. But if you take bad out of good, unwanted out of the wanted, then it's deraisa. And even if you plan to eat it right away. Now, what is the relevance of planning to eat it right away? Something that you're planning to eat it right away is derech achila. Anything we know, the Torah for sure wants us to have onik Shabbos and wants us to eat on Shabbos. So any boyer that's a function of our eating, it's part of how we eat, that is exempt from the hilchos boyer. So that's why if you're doing something right away, even if you're going to eat right away, but if you're taking psolos out of oichel, that's a deraisa no matter what, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. Okay. Next, the second way that it's brer deraisa is imhu boyer bekli. If you use a special tool to do brer, so this doesn't mean using any utensil. It means if you use a utensil like a sifter that's specifically designed to do this act of brer. Shederech liverba. Imu boyer bekli shederech liverba kegoin the napu bekiver, like using a sifter. Chayiv afilu hu boyer ha'oichel v'napsolos. Even if you're using a sifter, and the sifter will retain the good stuff and let the bad stuff fall through, and v'daiti lechol miyad, and you plan to eat it right away, so it's almost derech hakila, it's still also derech became derech haboyer bekli. That's how it's done. Pamin hu boyer oichel v'napsolos. When you're using a tool, sometimes you're taking oichel out of the psolos, and sometimes kagoyin shenikve akiver dakin, if you have very fine holes in the sifter, the oichel ugas, and the food is thicker and the psolos is thinner, so the psolos will fall through the sifter while the thicker kernels will remain in the sifter. So there you're retaining the oichel and you're getting rid of the psolos. But sometimes it's the food, the good stuff falls out and the sifter retains the bad stuff. But if you use a keli, that it's not the normal way to use it, you're improvising, that's pater aval osir, because that's called doing a malacha, not kederech, kalach yad. And like any malacha, if you do it kalach yad, you are not over the deraisa. So that's the second way. The first way it was osir is psolos with the chaychel. The second way that it's osir is if you use a keli. And the third way that it's osir is afilu imhu boyer oichel v'napsolos. Even if you take oichel out of psolos, uvayode, and you're using your hands, you're not using a custom specialized tool. Shedaita lechol achashman, but you're doing it not to eat right away, but you're going to do it to eat at a later time. And how long is too long, we'll discuss later. The only time it is mutter is if you avoid all of these three problems. You have to avoid all these three things. You have to only take food away from the bad stuff. You have to use your hand, and we'll soon see that a fork, a knife, a spoon is good as well, because they're just extensions of your hand. And it has to be done in a way where you're going to be using it right away. This avoids doing it the exact way that brer was designed to be done. Therefore, if you avoid these three things, then it'll be mutter. These are the main rules. The Yesra Pratim and the fire and we'll get back to the Mishnah Berurah a little bit later when we learn the Sukkah. So now we know what we have to see is we have to check from the Gemara why these three things are a problem.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, just to make it as applicable as possible. So preparing the hearing morning in shul, which is the most pressing thing on our minds, how would the proper way to do that?
So I want to specifically discuss. That's what we're going to actually. That is. You're laughing, but preparing hearing is specifically discussed by the poskim, because not because the Rav always is there, and it's not like at home where you can avoid a scrutiny. It's because everybody agrees that that's one of the most important avoidance that we do on Shabbos. So it's perfectly logical to assume that's what's the very which is one of the most important avoidance we do on Shabbos, so it makes sense why the place can feel that it's necessary to discuss it. So we'll get to that a little bit later.
Okay, great.
The
No,
first
just it's done in advance also, and it's done for not for yourself. Let's say if you don't like hearing, I mean, there's so many people.
Right. So all that's going to come out. Those are all the important halachas. So this is very, very relevant. That's why I wanted to learn the Mishnah Berurah, because it's really, really relevant to us. It's extremely relevant to us. On the regular, none of us are going to be doing any weaving anytime soon, but we all eat herring, and we all have to prepare Shabbos meals.
The first step of herring preparation, especially when in respect to boirer, is separating oneself for mafter and haftarah out of the tzibur and into the kitchen.
Out of the tzibur into
Akiva, you always have the spiritual component to this.
Akiva, I always told you. I say a mitzvah, pater mitzvah.
But this is very serious stuff, because like David was asking, is it a problem preparing too early if it's before davening, or is it better to go in the middle of davening? And I'm going to slip some of the punchline is, I think we'll all look at it together and we'll make our own assessment. But I think we're all going to agree by the time we're done is that it's more oiskal halacha to leave in the middle of Musaf to prepare the herring than it is to do it before.
Is this the pyramid?
That's very relevant. It's more, and of course,
which hat are you wearing?
And it's probably also important for those people that go out during laning to pre-test the food, so the oil that comes to the main kiddush will be guaranteed that the food that they're eating is good because it's even being pre-tested. That's also, sacrificing ourselves for the great tzibur to make sure that their kiddush will be perfect without any difficulties. But we'll get there in a second. If someone had many different types of foods in front of him, and this already, the first line of the Gemara is already a subject of controversy, because is the problem of boyer only if it's oichel b'tech psilus or psilus b'tech oichel? What if you have two different foods, but I only want to eat one of those foods? For instance, my kanaiks, I only like the greens. I don't like the reds. So am I allowed to take the reds out of the greens? They're both food. They're both good. But right now I'm looking for one over the other. Most poskim hold that if you have two different foods and you're looking to separate one from the other, it would be a problem. The only exception to that is, so if there's different types of herrings in a pile, different types of gefilte fish in a pile, I'm not allowed to start separating them out. But if there's a plate of gefilte fish, there's some bigger pieces and some smaller pieces, there you're allowed to go looking for the small pieces because it's the same in. But if it's different medium or even prepared differently, that would also make it into a separate bin. So talking about the minute oichel, boyer of oichel. Now we're about to learn a brisa that makes no sense, and the subject of the rest of the Omer is to try to make sense out of this brisa. So boyer of oichel, you could be boyer and eat. Boyer maniach, you could be boyer and you could leave it there. The lo yiver, but you shouldn't make boyer. And if you did make boyer, chayav chatas. So the Gemara says, "My comer." There's no kasha to be asked from this brisa. All we can say is, "Huh?" That's what my comer means. So Omer Ula says, "Hachika Omer." This is how we would frame for the brisa. So Ula is the first attempt at explaining the brisa, and he said, "Boyer of oichel l'boy b'yoyim." You're allowed to make breira for use that day. Uboyer umaniach l'boy b'yoyim. You, even if you're not eating it immediately, but you're eating it a little bit later today, but it's for today, you're allowed to make breira. But if you want to make breira today, if you want to do boyer today to prepare a meal for tomorrow, that lo yiver, that is not allowed. And birer, and if you did make such a breira, then chayav chatas, that would be a deraisa. So that was the first shot in this brisa. Now, if you noticed, that does not resemble any of the three tanoim brought down in the Mishnah Berurah. And the reason why that wasn't brought down is in a minute we're going to see, because it was slugged up. So ber is a deraisa, yet you're saying that we waive the deraisa if you're doing it for today. Well, that's strange, because you don't find such a pass by any of the other malachas of Shabbos. You're not allowed to bake just because you plan to eat that cake today. Are you allowed to cook because you want to eat today? So why should you be allowed to do boyer because you want to use it sometime today?
Plus, you're preparing from Shabbos to Chol.
Right. So that, right. So
why isn't that an issue?
It might be. So you're saying what you're suggesting is not only a problem of boyer, you also have a problem of being meichen in Shabbos to Chol. I assume that's what you mean to bring up.
Yeah.
And you're right. You're right. So it's not
Yeah,
allowed.
Well, it could be Friday night to Shabbos, right?
He's suggesting that it's okay.
Ula.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what Lamocher means. Lamocher might mean Friday night for Shabbos, right? It might be Friday night for Shabbos day, where you would avoid the problem of Meichen and Shabbos L'chol. But it's not. It doesn't matter because we're abandoning Ulos Pshat anyway. Elo Omer Abchista. What it means is Boyer v'Oichel Pachas Mikashir. You could be Boyer v'Oichel less than a shir. We know that when it comes to anything food related on Shabbos, the shear that it has to be done is on a groigris. And the Mishmur tells us that doesn't mean each piece that you're sorting is a groigris. If the entire mass that you're working with is the shear of a groigris, it's subject to the halachas of Shabbos. So you're allowed to boyer v'oichel pachas b'kashir and boyer umaniach pachas b'kashir. You can make a boyer even for later, as long as it's less than a shear. But uchashir lo yiver. But if you have the shear of a groigris, then you shouldn't. Then beer, and if you did do that, chayiv chatos. Then you'd be chayiv chatos. So again, the Gemara asks an obvious kasha, and that's why we didn't find this condition in the Mishnah Berurah halacha l'maisa, because again it's shloked up. Maska for R Yosy, the chimuter lefo is pachas b'kashir. Do you ever find that you're allowed to do an iser if you do less than the shear? That doesn't make sense. And Rashi actually elaborates on it, and Rashi says nehi. I have too many distractions on my screen. Nehi, the chiyav chatos lecha. There might not be a chiyav chatos, but isur miyaika. There's definitely an iser regarding the chatishir. The kaim alon chatishir asum in the Torah the perek basar de yuma. At the end of the last perek of yuma, in the last perek of yuma, it says that you're not allowed to do an avera even though you're not doing the full shear. You might not be subject to the punishments, but that doesn't mean you're allowed to do it. The hechi katani boyer lechatchila. How could Rabbi Yosef suggest? How could Rabbi Chitza suggest that you're allowed to do boyer with a half a shear? So remember, I spoke on earlier that the Lisa Rav, who's your child today, he was a grandson of the Chacham Tzvi. The Chacham Tzvi is the major player in the Chatzi Shir League, and he says that you say, the Chacham Tzvi says that we say that Chatzi Shir is asur min Torah, that's only by eating things. So, for instance, you're not allowed to eat nevela. The iser, you'll get malchus of eat a kazayis of nevela. Well, what if may I eat a half a kazayis of nevela? Zokt, the Chacham Tzvi, explaining the Gemara in Yuma, that Chatzi Shir is asur min Torah because it's chazi l'tzterufe. The reason why I can't eat the first half of the kazayis is because I might continue and eat the second half of the kazayis. So, Zokt the Chacham Tzvi, we only say Chatzi Shir is asur min Torah by things that are chazil l'tzterufe. If I eat more, it's going to be over. Therefore, it only applies to eating. So it would not apply to anything else. But from this Gemara, you clearly see that it applies to things other than eating. It applies to afiyah. It applies to boyer. So the Yad David, to explain the Chacham Tzvi Shita, says that even though we're bringing up Chatzi Shir here, and Rashi says Chatzi Shir is asur min Torah, the Chatzi Shir that would be relevant in this Gemara would only be Midirabban. So the kasha that was asked by Rabbi Yosef on Rabbi Chista is even if by something like this you don't have the deraisa of Chatzi Shir, but you surely have the Dirabban of Chatzi Shir. So how could you allow it l'chatchila? So therefore, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, and Rabbi Yosef, his pshat does become accepted in halacha, as we learned. Rabbi Yosef, the way to understand our brisa is boyer v'oichel biyad. You're allowed to do prayer with a hand, not using the proper keli. Boyer umaniach biyad. So you can make prayer. You could make boyer to eat right away with your hand, and you're allowed to make boyer to use a little bit later with your hand. The kanayin uvatamchui, but if you used a kanayin uvatamchui, kanayin is a type of fadl that acted sort of as a sifter. So you put things in the top, and only things that would fit the shape at the bottom of the funnel. The funnel had a round hole, so longer sticks wouldn't fall out, but smaller round kernels would fall out. So it was a funnel that was used as a sifter. Tamach is just a plate. You put a whole bunch of things on a big plate, shake it a little bit, and it tends to separate the different parts. There, lo yiver lechatchila, you may not do bayer. However, in Bir Potter, and the reason for that is those kelim were not designed to do boyer. You're just improvising using them. So therefore, it's Potter avaloser. Uvenap uvekiver. But if you want to use the sifters, nap is a sifter with smaller holes, kiver is a sifter with larger holes. But if you use one of those, which are the tools that are designed to do boyer, lo yiver, that wouldn't be allowed in Bir chayiv chatas. So there's 3 levels of this brisa. Even though if you learn the brisa itself, it doesn't seem like there's 3 levels. The brisa just says, how you look on the video, boyer v'oichel, boyer u'muniach, v'lo v'mbir chayiv chatos. It's not clear in the brisa that the brisa means to express 3 different cases, but Rabbi Yosef wants to learn that the brisa is speaking about 3 different cases: mutter, potter, avaloser, and chayiv.
Yes, sorry.
Yes.
So right at the end it says chayiv chatas. So is that he did it b'shoygig and he didn't know what he was doing?
The Gemara, I find in Mishnayos, the Gemaras never even contemplate that a Yid should do a malacha, the Raisa, b'mezid. So all of the chayivs that you ever find in the Mishnayos, or whenever you're discussing the Surim, it always talks about being chayiv chatas, because we're assuming that if you did the Avera, it was definitely by mistake. That's a benefit of the doubt that my teachers never gave me.
But to do it b'mezid anyways, you would need hasra at least.
Yes, in order to be mechuyev misa b'dei adam, such as skila for a violation of Shabbos, it would require edim and hasra. But if one did it b'mezid without edim and hasra, there's still a chiyuv kares, which is no walk in the park.
What's Rav Yosef's makor for saying that boro ichel biyad is mutter?
It's all about what is the normal way to do brayer. The isser of sorting is only usher doing it one of the ways that it's designed to be done. If you're doing it in an unusual fashion, that's not covered under the prohibition.
Well, how did they do brayer? And
the right way to do it would be either with a sifter, and then any way they would do it, if they did it with a sifter, that was a prime way. Another way they did it was well in advance, and then they might not use a sifter. And a third way they would do it, even without a sifter, would be picking out psilus from oichel.
So by hand or by what? How?
Even by hand. Very good, very good. I said it's a walk in the park. So David Lightman says today a walk in the park is also chayiv course. You can go to jail for life for a walk in the park.
So eating your fish, right? So you're allowed to take out with your hands. You're allowed to take the bones out?
No, you're allowed to take the fish out of the bones.
No.
Right? Taking psilus mitoich oichel is also no matter what, but you're allowed to take the fish off the bone.
Right. Not the bone off the fish, but that's not the way you usually do it.
Well, if it's in your mouth, we're going to learn, you're for sure allowed to pull the bones out. But when it's on the plate and you're digging at it with your fork.
So what does it mean here? The first thing, Rav Yosef Biyad.
Correct.
So, right? So he's suggesting that's okay.
It is okay. But that's where oichel biyad. You're taking the food away from the bone biyad.
And Rav Yosef holds that's mutter l'chatchila because the only things that are aser are, psolis and oichel or the other things that you described.
Correct.
Since this was never part of the malacha, this is mutter l'chatchila.
Correct. I forgot to mention, now that we're discussing comments, David Dayan brought up a very interesting observation that was tickling my brain a little bit, but I didn't articulate it. And that is, we learned yesterday when we were learning the Mishnah that lists off the different malachas, and there were 4 processes covered. There was the first process was of baking, which had 13 steps. Then there was the process of weaving, which had 11 steps. And then there was a process of tanning, of preparing hide, which had 8 steps. And then there was binyan, which had 7 steps. So David the Young wanted to suggest that has to do with how many times we go around the tzitzis. Now, I think by tzitzis is 13, 11, 7, and 5. But David the Young was asking if there's a connection between the two. And who knows, things are always connected in Yiddishkeit. I just don't know what the connection is. But it's a very interesting thing that he brought up.
Yossi, in respect to the psoilus, so you gave example of the bones, and I guess watermelon pits would fall in the same category, right. But the Mike and Ike's is not quite the same. Is that psoilus is based on...
Right, so that's based on the Rishonim who learn that psoilus doesn't necessarily mean something that nobody wants. Psoilus could mean something that I don't want at this time. Right. So if you're bringing it up, we might as well see Tosfos. Tosfos is Goris that there's an Isser Boyer, and he's Goris it right into the words of the Brisa that it applies even when I'm sorting red Mechanics from green Mechanics, or if I want to get the black licorice jelly beans out of the other gourmet jelly beans. So the Chempir Shrach ba Oichel mitoich Oichel Shayich Breira Sheboyer Oisoi She'enei Chafetz Lecha. I take those foods that I don't want to eat out of mitoich Oisoi Sheroitz Lecha. I take them out of the pile of food that I want to leave there that I do want to eat. The Oisoi She'en Chafetz Boy, the food that I don't want to eat, Choshev Psoilus Lagabe Oisoi Shechafetz Lecha. The food that I don't want to eat, the black jelly beans that I don't like, is considered Psoilus in comparison to the red jelly beans that I do want to eat. So the Rishonim clearly say that psoilus is not necessarily what's absolute psoilus, it's relative psoilus. Right now, to me, that is psoilus, because I don't want that.
It's ironic. I saw after the Ufruf, the kids have this stash and they pour it all into one pile and they start separating it into different things. And I thought for sure it was Bayer. To me, it looked like Bayer. I want only this, I only want this. And Rabbi Philip told me that the katchilet's mutter. Is it not what you just said? It's oichel mitoich oichel?
Yeah.
Well, that's Tosfos. It's not how maybe it's not Psak.
All the Rishonim seem to learn that oichel mitoich oichel. But you have to understand, what they're doing is I don't know if they're doing it for right now or for later. Maybe they're doing it right now. But it's definitely they're taking oichel, they're not taking psoilus. They're taking what they want.
So Yossi, what about pistachio nuts then?
What about pistachio nuts?
Because you're usually taking the shell off first before you get to the nut, right?
Right. Oh, so you're taking the psoilus away from the oichel, you mean?
Right, yeah.
I mean, by definition, it's only...
That's
by definition, to eat it, you're taking the psoilus away from the oichel.
Right. I guess that's the way you eat it. So.
Well, it's more than that. Even though I'm cracking the peel open, but I'm going for the food inside.
Yeah, but you're taking
the word psoilus we're talking about is I'm going for the psoilus. I'm not going for the psoilus. You're drilling down to
no, we said you have to take the oichel first. You're not allowed to take.
My purpose of the activity is to extract the oichel, not to extract the psoilus. So the purpose of the activity of cracking open a pistachio cell is to extract the oichel, not to extract the psoilus. So I don't know if we're looking at the method as much as we're looking at the intent.
Okay.
I believe that there's halacha at that if you're going for, like you're saying, if you're going just for the food, if there's no other way, that's the derech pila, then it's not a problem.
So we'll learn the halachas of the Mishabura, but the next meeting that we have at night, where Rabbi Philip always likes to discuss, and lately he's been trying to just keep his halachas discussions, the halachas relevant to the daf. I'm going to ask him specifically to elaborate on boirer and why is he allowing us why is he allowing children to do that? We'll ask him, now that we have a deeper understanding of the sugya, we'll appreciate more when he explains his reasoning. Okay. Zokta Heilige Gemara weiter. Maskav lo Rav Hamnuna. So Rabbi Yosef, we just covered, says, he brings up this concept that Breira is also midaraisa if it's done with a proper keli. If it's not done, if it's done with your hand, then it won't be a problem. And the Achronim speak out that when you're using a fork and a knife to do your no one's picking the fish with their hands off the bone. They're using a fork. So maybe a fork should be like a kanonian tamkoi, which we say is osur lechatchila. The answer to that is no. The only time we consider the keli, even the asur lechatchila, if the reason why you're using the keli assists in the boirer. The fork and knife doesn't make the boirer any easier. You can just as well do it with your fingers. The reason why you're not using your fingers is you don't want to be rude or you don't want to get your fingers dirty. That doesn't make it into a keli. That makes the fork and knife into an extension of your hand. And that's why it's not even considered like a kanin and a tamchoi. That would be osur lechatchila. Anyway, matzkav lo Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna does not like Rabbi Yosef's pshat, even though we do remain and accept his pshat. Rav Hamnuna says midei k'dayin v'tamchoi gatoni. We don't find that the Brisa separates out a third middle case, and this is how Tosfos learns. There's no middle case that's being sorted out that's pater of asur. The Brisa seems to be discussing two cases, where brer is asur and where it's not. So Rav Hamnuna didn't like this pshat. El Omer Rav Hamnuna proposes a second pshat, which is also negei halacha l'maisa, and that's boyer v'oichel mitech hapsaylos. You're allowed to extract what you want from what you don't want. Boyer umaniach oichel mitech hapsaylos. You're even allowed to do it to prepare for sometime in the future, but in the immediate future. And psoilus mitech oichel, but you're never, ever, ever allowed to take psoilus away from the oichel. You're not allowed to take the bone out of the fish. Lo yiver, the imbirer chayev chatos, even if it's done by hand. So these are where we got our three absolute isurim from that the Mishnah Berurah identifies right before he starts the whole halachos. Maskav Abaye, midi oichel mitech psoilus katani. It doesn't mention anything explicitly about oichel mitech psoilus. So either way, it should be a problem. Amar Abaye, boyer v'oichel alter. Boyer is you're allowed to do it if you're eating it right away. Boyer umaniach alter. You're allowed to make boyer if you're going to be using it right away, even if you're not eating it immediately, but you're putting it down to use right away. Ulaboy b'yoin lo yiver. But even for a later period of time that day, that you're not allowed to do boyer. In beer, nase keboyer lo oitzer v'chay. And if you did make boyer to use in an hour, and I'm just using an hour as an example, but we're going to have to clarify exactly what's called right away and what's not. Thank you very much. Then it's as if you were boyer to put away to store, which is a real deraisa v'chayiv chafetz. Amru Rabbanan kamei de Rava. The Rabbanan told Rava over what Abaye said. Amalu, they said, "Ooh, shaper omenach meini." Abaye et git gesucht. Ooh, der Abaye zay git gesucht. Du sag git pshat. So this is basically the sugya of boyer. I mean, the Gemara goes on a little bit, but this is the meat of the sugya. So I just want to point out a couple of things. So before I point out what Rabbi Elephant said, I want to get into what the Shulchan Aruch says. I love Rabbi Elephant, but the Shulchan Aruch still trumps everything. Okay, so let's see what the Chaber says. And we'll run through quickly some Mishnah Berurahs, we won't learn everything, and then we'll get a better idea of how everything comes together. So the Mechaber says explicitly that the boyer applies even Eichlim, boyer min acher, and you separate one species from another. If you used the proper tool for it, chayiv no matter what. The kandu v'tamchli potter of a because that's not the right keli to use. That's one way it'll lead to a deraisa. Then bir biyadoi idei alter mutter. The only way it's mutter is if you use your hand and you're using it immediately. So this goes now to David Leibman's question, what's called miyad? So now that Ramah gives us a little bit more information and tells us if it's for that meal, if it's for the meal, shemesava, so if you're preparing it for the meal that you're having, shemesava miyad, so if you're preparing it immediately before the meal, mikri la'alter, that's called right away. David also asked, what if I'm preparing a meal for somebody else, but I'm not going to eat it at all? So that the Ramah deals with David Leibman's question as well. So it's likely that the Ramah consulted with David Leibman or someone just like him when he wrote his parish, because he needed to cover all of the relevant shilas, and who would know it better than somebody who's a Oishik B'Seich Tzibur, who sacrifices himself to help prepare the Kiddush for somebody else, such as Novid Leitman, such as Shlomi Feintuch, and those are the important people that the Poiskim have to consult with to determine what's allowed and what's not allowed. And Duvi Menzelevsky, that's right. The Rav spoke all about Oishik B'Seich Tzibur in the last meeting, and he mentioned, I think on Friday he quoted from Mishnah Pirkei Avos that says that any person who's Oishik B'Seich Tzibur has a special protection from a virus because he's Oishik B'Seich Tzibur, if I was listening correctly. Okay? If you want to prepare a salad, you're allowed to pull the good leaves of lettuce out of the bad bunch, if there's any bad there. You're allowed to do enough. You're allowed to separate enough that would be used for that suda. And the Mishur discusses what if there's extra. There's a whole bunch of different things. I don't want to learn anything. I just want to learn some of the more prominent things. And that is as follows. So the first thing I'm going to learn is what David Shaila was. David Shaila was if you're allowed to do it when you're preparing for somebody else. So it says over here, if you prepare extra because you want to have for after the Suda as well, or if you prepare extra so you should be able to use it for the next meal, that's a deraisa. That's very serious. So the reason why boyer is so dangerous is because you're doing things that you're allowed. But if you do just a little too much, now it's chayav chatas. So boyer is playing with fire really. Normally when you prepare for an immediate meal, you don't prepare oske cheshbon. You want to have a little extra because you want to make sure that you won't run out. That's not a problem. So if you had extra from a meal, but you only prepared what was reasonable, and even though you prepared in abundance, which is also normal, that's not a problem. What if you're preparing for somebody else? One person can prepare. You don't have to have every single nudnik in the kitchen. You can have only the people in charge stay in the kitchen. That's the normal way of doing it. Even if you hate herring, you're still allowed to prepare the herring. It doesn't mean he's eating with them. It means he's preparing it on their behalf. Okay. And again, davka, where you're taking the oichel from the psoilus, you're never allowed to take the psoilus away from the oichel. Now I want to get into another shaila, because boyer, we're talking about boyer by food, but there's boyer by other things as well. And there's also the question of big, if you want to pick a big piece of fish or a small piece of fish off a platter. So I'm just going to look a little bit later where the Mechaber talks about so if you have a plate where they have a whole bunch of pieces of meat or pieces of fish, and you want to move things around to get a specific piece, but they're all the same species, that would be allowed. Unless if there were some that were not good, or people, if there are some pieces that are burnt or overcooked, there's a problem. Or if there's some raw fish mixed with cooked fish, there would be a problem. You have to take what you want to eat now. Now he goes to a tepuchim chamotzim that I don't want to deal with, but what I want to do is I want to look at something else. The basat slim of vushel, if you have two types of meats, mikri based minim le'inyan zeh. If you have different types of chickens, or if they're prepared differently, you have to be worried when you go to a big kiddush. You might have many different types of even oif meat prepared. And people take some and they separate some, the caterer separates some to use for much Shabbos. What you have to do is you have to pull out what you want to eat now and not set out the ones that you don't want to eat now, because that's taking the trailers away. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This doesn't only apply to food items. You're looking for a suit in your closet, and you have to sift through other suits. You're looking for a svarim in a pile, and you have to sift through other svarim. Shaykh Breyer, there's also the problem of Breyer. V'alkein, tzarech liver ze'amin sheroitza, you have to look and pull the suit that you want out. Ze'amin sheroitza little achshav, v'shar yishar al-b'kaimim, and then you leave the rest on the shelf. Don't take all the bad suits out so that you can find a good suit. What if you have multiple begadim lying one behind the other on the wall? So I'm imagining if you see like a display case where you have a peg that comes out of the wall and there's 5 suits on it, and you want the back suit, and you're looking, achar bigda, you're looking for your beged, or you're going to the shelf where the hats are, where the gloves are, and there's tons of other gloves and tons of other hats, and you got to sort through them to get to yours. That would not be called boyer. If you have a whole bunch of pieces of gefilte fish piled up on a plate, and he wants the piece that's at the bottom, and you push all the ones you want to kichel from the bottom of the basket. The Rav said during coronavirus, you're not allowed to dig through a kichel basket. That was when we still had kichel baskets. Now we're not even there. Now we wish we could just be happy with the restrictions of taking the kichel from the top of the pile. Nowadays, we don't get kichel at all. But if you wanted to take the kichel at the bottom of the pile, you're allowed to move all the kichel away, the litloy, and to take the kichel at the bottom that has just the right amount of sugar, just the right amount of crispiness, and that wouldn't be butter. That would be allowed. Okay, so let's put this aside now, and I want to go through quickly a whole bunch of other halachas that are relevant to boyer, and they're as follows.
About the clothing, Yossi.
Yes.
Are those drabanans or what? That because the original is about food. The real lav of boyer
is referring to food. I think
food connect. Why would anything else be usher?
Because it's still separating good from bad. I would have to ask the Rav, but I'm pretty sure it's a deraisa. Now that takes us to our next question. What happens if you did do boyer? Does that mean you can't use it anymore, or can you still use it? So the Mishnah Berurah says, if you did it b'shagi, if you did boyer by mistake, no problem. Anyone's still allowed. It doesn't disqualify for the food, and for sure, if a guy did it, it's not a problem. Now, David asked another question. What's called preparing it for immediate use? What's called immediate? Can I prepare kiddush before Shabbos? So there's a whole mishmash of approaches. The Ramah says that if you want to prepare, if you want to prepare kiddush, you have to wait until davening is over, and you have to prepare the kiddush right before the kiddush. But the Beis Yosef brings down from Rabbeinu Yerucham that if
he obviously didn't daven the Agudah.
If you're preparing it a little earlier, except that the Suda, it's as long as so the Beis Yosef brings from Rabbeinu Yerucham, you're allowed to prepare even hours before the meal, as long as you're preparing for the next meal. So you can prepare kiddush even before davening, as long as you're preparing kiddush, but you're not allowed to prepare shalashudas before you had the main meal. You're only allowed to prepare for the next meal. So that means you can prepare well in advance, provided that you're only preparing for the next meal. The Rambam says not like that. The Rambam says you have to be eating it immediately. So
Yossi.
Halacha l'maisa. I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah. You're talking about just boyer. We're not talking about hachana here.
Hachana is never a problem because hachana is only also Shabbos l'choil.
Yeah, so I'm saying you can prepare shalashidas if you're setting the table without doing any.
No, that's right. Yeah, I mean doing boyer. As far as preparation for sure is allowed. Preparation that involves boyer, that's where you have an issue. So Rav Moshe says that it's relative. You have to look at the practicality. If you're just eating with your wife, yeah, you're only allowed to prepare that salad right before you eat it. But if you're going to have guests and there's a lot of food involved, of course you have to allow yourself enough time before the meal to prepare it so that you'll be ready for the meal. That's what the Igros Moshe says. The Moshe function. The Chazon Ish says that even if we allow you to prepare something before, maximum is a half hour. The Chazon Ish says the maximum before, even with guests, is a half hour before. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was also one of the big poskim of Yerushalayim, says, no, Amekel, no matter how early it is, like the Rishonim, like the Ramah, like the Beis Yosef, who says, as long as you're only preparing for the next meal that's coming, even if it's multi-hours before, it would still be allowed. And Rabbi Yosef says something that's very relevant. He says, if you can prepare as early as you want, as long as right when you finish preparing, you're going to go to the Suda. But if you want to prepare early because you have something else that you want to do in between your preparation and the meal, for instance, the missus wants to prepare the salad, prepare all the things that require butter early in the morning because she wants to go to shul. So there's an event that she's participating in between her butter and the meal that Rabbi Yosef says is not allowed. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yosef, you're better off preparing the Kiddush during Musaf than preparing the Kiddush before davening, because you're not allowed to participate in an event in an activity after you make the boiler before you eat the meal.
With all respect to those people who are preparing it, they always make Kiddush and eat from it right away. There is no gap.
Why do you think they do? Because they're very makbid on halacha.
That's right.
They want to make sure.
That's exactly it.
That's right. Okay. Now,
The
Taz is an interesting shaila. What if you?
No, because we want to be Yitzchak Choladeus.
That's right. What if dirt falls into? You have a cup of a drink, and dirt falls in. You know, a fly. The Taz is talking about a fly. But even if anything falls in you don't like, are you allowed to take it out? That's boyer psoilus mitachayil. Even if it's a piece of kichel, if you don't want it there, it's psoilus mitachayil. So the Taz says it's not a problem. All you do is don't just take the fly by itself, take it with some mashka, and then it's oichel mitachayil. But the Shulchan Aruch Harav says how could you allow such a thing? If you take out some mashka with the fly, that mashka now also becomes psoilus. No one's going to drink that mashka that comes out with the fly. So the Shulchan Aruch Harav says if you have something in your cup that you got to get out, you have to pour until it goes out. But you can't actually scoop out what you don't like.
So yes, the halach lamaisa, when we prepare kiddush and we put out the herring plates with the toothpicks, so many times quite soon after, or maybe in the blink of an eye, you'll walk by and there'll be used toothpicks back in the plate. And then since we want the island to have a no when they come for kiddush, we need to pick out those toothpicks. So how would we do
that? I'm not sure. I'm sure if there's a piece of herring on those toothpicks, then you're allowed to still suck it up.
No, the toothpicks are not me'urav.
That's true. That's also true. But then, that reminds you of a story. You'd have to, if you take the toothpick to suck the toothpick, because there's still a little bit of geschmack of juice left on it, then it's allowed. It's just a little echoed it. But it reminds me of that story I told you once about the salesman who was sitting with an old lady, and she was chatting with him, and there was a bowl of peanuts on the table. And as they're chatting, he says, "Do you mind if I have some peanuts?" She says, "No, go right ahead." And he's eating peanuts. And when you're eating peanuts, you're not focusing and you're speaking to somebody. You don't realize before he knew it, he ate up the whole bowl of peanuts. And he was all embarrassed that he freshed up all her peanuts. So he said, "I'm so embarrassed. I ate up all your peanuts." She says, "Don't worry about it. I don't have good teeth, so I can only suck off the chocolate."
Back to the kiddush. I'm on a practical level. If I'm not mistaken, it's Reb David Aber who prepares the herring. You're preparing the kichel and everything else. The herring is prepared before davening.
What's the burr you're concerned about?
No, the question is timing.
But that's what I'm trying to say. We're only talking about
achana is fine. It's just the burr that's the problem.
It's not achana. It's not achana issue. It's just boirer.
Yeah, but he can't do the boirer too early.
Well, that's what we're doing. There is no boirer really involved in herring. What boirer is?
Don't you separate the herring from the onions?
Yeah, both of them.
They're not more. They're not really mixed.
No,
they're not really mixed. Oh, I'm sorry. I just remembered that's where Rabbi Phillips is saying that the nash they're allowed to separate because it's only a problem of boirer if they're actually connected, mingled with each other. But if they're just separate items that are together, it won't be a problem. And I'm trying to remember what specific halacha he was referring to, what case he was referring to. Let me just see what he says.
Even if Aber does it way before, it's still for the next meal. It's not. He's not doing it the night before. He's doing it that morning.
Yeah, but he's going to daven. He has something to do in between, so it's a question.
So do we. We go to daven musaf. So what's the difference if it's musaf or shachos or?
Talk to Kiva. Kiva was trying to make the differentiation. So,
well, I just want to make sure that when you do make kiddush, it depends which stash you're taking it from. That's all.
That's what I was talking about. The Lagabe this shaila of taking a sefer from amongst Svarim or a beged amongst Begodim, there's actually a shaila if Breira applies to it.
Yes, you move your notes over. We want to see the notes.
And David Zolti actually raised, is there boyer by non-food items? So the Ravid says, and the Meiri says that it's not called boyer. It's not called boyer. If you want to take the Marshak says, if you want to take a sefer out of a svarim or a beged amongst the begodim, the Marshak says that's not called boyer. Why is it not called boyer? Because suits aren't really intermingled, they're not mixed together. They're each individually packaged, so to speak, and you're just looking for the right one. So there, the concept of boyer wouldn't apply at all. So I believe if you have a whole bunch of different nashes that are in their little bags or something, there shouldn't be a problem with boyer at all because they're never mixed together. They're not really mixed together. Even though they're sitting together, they're not called mingled together. They're not called connected.
Well, there's your answer to your Mike and Ike's.
That might be the answer to Mike and Ike's, according to the Marshag. And the Ravid says you don't need it anyway because beged mi begodim is oichel mi oichel, and according to the Ravid, oichel mi oichel is not a problem because we mentioned earlier it's a machlekes for shonim. If oichel from oichel toishes, of course, it's a problem, but according to the Ravid, it's not a problem. But even if that is a problem, svarim and begodim are things that are never really mixed together, and I'm not sure exactly what's considered mixed. But Mike and Ike's is not the same as different suits on the shelf that I'm looking through. But I guess different types of nash could be that they're not really called mixed together, and that's why it's allowed. We could ask Rabbi Philip, it'll give us a deeper understanding. Okay, we got to go weiter. But that was a very interesting sugya. Okay, let's see. Now we're just going to deal with the final remnants of this sugya, but we've already really went through the main beef of it. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. So again, we applauded Shaper on Omer Nachmeni. We applauded Abayi's Pshat, that it's all about how quickly you're doing it. Zokta Heilige Gemara. We had two types of food. Ubir v'ochal, ubir v'hiniach. You made boyer to eat right away or to eat a little later. Rav Ashi Masni Potter. Rav Ashi learned that in this case it's Potter. Rav Yirmi B'difti Masni Chayiv. And Rav Yirmi B'difti says that one would be Chayiv, a deraisa, for doing that. Rav Ashi Masni Potter. How could he say that it's Potter? Because Potter has the connotation that it's Potter of al-Asr. And the problem is, where do you ever find a case that's Potter of al-Asr? If you learn, like the Gemara says earlier, let me just point out what Rashi says, Potter of al-Asr, mutar lechatchila lo havi. It's not mutar lechatchila. One second. No, I'm sorry. Here it is. Latanya la'il chayiv. It says before chayiv. Vi beboyer umaniach la'alter mutar lechatchila hava upotter of al-Asr leka. So when we were looking at the teretz of the Gemara that discusses doing it now or doing it later, so let's have a look. That was I believe was Abaye. Boyer v'chel alter, boyer v'lich alter, l'boyer b'leim layiver, m'bir nasa k'boyer loicher v'chayiv. So according to Abaye, it's either mutter lechatchila or chayiv. There is no middle of the road. So the question is, if you're making that distinction between making boyer for right now or making boyer for later, it's either mutter and ganten or it's chayiv. So where in the world did Rav Ashi get this potter? There is no middle of the road. Vatani chayiv. So to Merloi Kasha, Habakani v'tamchli habi napli v'kivra. That Rav Ashi learned that it's potter of al-Asr is because of a different reason. It's because you did it kalachar yad. You used a kanan and tamchli, which is kalachar yad. That's why he said it's potter of al-Asr. So he brings in another factor into the equation. Okay, I'm getting some messages. Okay, am I cutting out or am I okay? I'm not cutting out. Gesagt wir weiter. Ki Azar Abdimi Omar, Shabsa der Abibi Hava. In those days, the Rosh Yeshivas had multi-functions. One of the things that they did is there were multiple Rosh Yeshivas, they would switch off being in the yeshiva with the Talmidim for Shabbos. But when they were in the yeshiva with the Talmidim for Shabbos, they served. They didn't just sit there with the Talmidim, they actually worked in the kitchen, which takes most of the fun away from working in the kitchen. But they used to work in the kitchen. And what they would do is as follows. So what happened was, it was the Shabbos of Rabibi. It was his turn to be in yeshiva for Shabbos. The Kloy Rab Ami and Rab Asi. And Rab Ami and Rab Asi, I guess, were Talmidim, or they came. And Rabibi would be serving them. So Shadya Kamayu, Kilkala the Peri, he put a whole basket of mixed pears that also had their stems connected to them. He just threw it in front of them. He didn't separate the pears to give each one their own peri. He didn't separate the stem from the peri. Below Yadana, I'm not sure why Rabibi did that. Was it a halachic reason? Did he feel that you're not even allowed to separate that? He could have just taken off the apple from the stem and separated the apple from the oranges and give each guy an apple. Maybe he held that's usher. Or maybe imishum ayin yafa huda machavin. It looks better to bring a whole big basket full of pears and dump it out, because that looks much more. It looks much more balavatish. Looks much more rich. So maybe that's why he did it, because he wanted to have a nice pie dish. That's that halacha. Next, Chizkiya Omar. Chizkiya said, "Haboyer termusim mitoch psoila shalhen." Termus are a certain type of bean that requires a lot of prep, a lot of cooking. So if one separates the termus from its psoilas, chayiv, one would be chayiv. Now, termus is the product that you want to eat. You're taking it out of the psoilas. That's oichel mitoch psoilas. And Chizkiya says chayiv. Lema k'saber Chizkiya oichel mitoch psoilas osir. Does he hold oichel mitoch psoilas as osir? Unlike what we do. So Gemara knows shiny termusim have a different set of rules because they're prepared differently. The sholkele shiva zimni, they have to be cooked 7 times. The eloi shakli, if you didn't take them out, and that's one girsa, then there's another girsa of the eloi shalki if you didn't cook them, and they're based on 2 different shatim in Rashi. But let's first see the Rashi, the lusach that we have here. The eloi shakli lay, if you don't take out the termusim here, misrach, the termusim go bad. So Rashi tells us a very interesting pshat that makes me get dizzy. Because Rashi says, the loy shakli la'oichel, if you don't take the termus, which is the oichel, out of the psoilas that was left in the pot, since the bean becomes very soft and it could fall apart because it was so heavily cooked, misrach, it will get ruined. The hilchach oichel nami calls manchim uravoy havik psoilas. When the termus is still sitting in the pot that it was cooked with, and it's sitting amongst the psoilas in the pot, it itself is also not psoilas. Because if we left it in the pot, it would dissolve and become just like the psoilas. So therefore we look at it like we're taking the psoilas. Umiu oichelu, but lemais, it's what we eat. Umachmirin aleh lemahava hahu deshakol kapsoilas b'toichel. And therefore we consider it like psoilas, because had we left it there, it would be psoilas. That's a little bit of a difficult thing to understand. Rashi in the second shot says a little different. Rashi says you used to cook this termus with its psoilas 7 times. And every time you cooked it, some psoilas got separated from it, and you would take the psoilas out. And after the 7th time, there was pure termus. What this guy did was different. He cooked it 3 times, and then instead of taking out the psoilas the 3rd time, he took out the termus the 3rd time. Now, if you take out the termus the 3rd time, you still can't eat that termus, because that termus needs further processing. It has to be cooked 7 times. But the psoilas that you left in the pot is ready to go. It might not be as high quality food as the termus will be once it's fully prepared, but the stuff that's in the pot is already good as is. So when you're taking the termus out of the pot and you haven't finished cooking it 7 times, that termus is like psoilas because it's not ready to be eaten yet. Yet whatever was left in the pot has already finished its final stage of preparation. So that's why he answered, because he considers that like psoilas b'toichel. Okay, now
yes, what's left in the pot is not edible. I mean, you're not eating the skins, are you?
It is edible, but it's not the prize that we're looking for.
Yossi, isn't this termis a muster that they say in Gemara and Brachos talks about? Hashem says they boil it 7 times. I can't remember.
It was in order to prepare it. It would be cooked.
I know, but there's a whole muster on that they like kids they boil 7 times. Whatever. I have to look it up. I think Gemara and Brachos.
Halavai, I should remember. Halavai, I should remember.
All right.
Okay, if we would do the Zichru program, then we would know what daf it was on. Okay, let's see the Gemara weiter. Now we're going to be talking about grinding. Zok tehelu Gemara. Adjust the camera a bit. Okay, Zok tehelu Gemara. Omer Papa, hi man, this person, the porous silka, the porim silka, he chopped up beets. Chayiv mishum toichen is chayiv al toichen because he's chopping these beets thin. Omar Benasha, Haiman the sola silsi, if someone cuts pieces of wood, chayiv mishum toichen is chayiv al toichen. Omar Vashi, in kapara mishchasa, if he wants to cut them into a very specific size and he's using it for kindling wood, and he needs a very specific size, then chayiv mishum achatech will also be chayiv al achatech. Achatech is when you cut the leather hide into strips. There you're cutting those leather hides into very specifically sized strips, and that's why there's ish mechatech. So if you did that with wood, it would have the same issue. So this also becomes a whole big issue of are you allowed to chop a salad? When you make a salad, are you allowed to chop things very fine? So there's a lot of talk about it. I just don't want to get into it now because we're starting to run late. Zok more about the va'alosh, va'oifa. Losh is kneading and oifa is baking. Omer Papa, Shabbat Tana Didon Bishul Salamonin, the Hava B'Mishkan, the Nukat oifa. It doesn't make sense. Why would our Tana depart from discussing what the actual malachas were done in the Mishkan, which were cooking the Salamonim, and instead take us through the process of baking, which although is also, it's not the prime case of what was going on by the Mishkan. So tomorrow, Tana Didon Sidur the Pasnachid. Our Tana decided to go with the bread track, and that's because the Ran says it was most common. The shaila that people ask is, was there no afiyah in the Beis Hamikdash? Did we not bake lechem upon him every week? So that's also one of the malachas, and that gets into a whole discussion. There are certain who learn that the only malachas that are malachas that we identify as malachas that are asur on Shabbos are not malachas that were done in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Avodah. It's only malachas that were done to build the Mishkan. And we only look at those, and that's why the Gemara asks here by Oifa.
1 second. So why do we have boirer? The boirer we're using for food. You're saying
no, boirer was used in the preparation of the samamonim as well. In the preparation, they also have to separate seed from the plant. So there were all those malachas did occur when they prepared the samamonim. Rav Hai Goyen says, actually, that even malachas that were done in the process of the Beis Hamikdash are also malachas. The reason why oifa is not acceptable is because the afiyah of the lechem apanim, the afiyah of the shtei lechem, there were times where it was mutter to do those afiyahs on Shabbos. So it wouldn't be logical to use malachas that were allowed on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash as examples of what you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Omer of Achav bar Avira, Haiman de Shoda Sichsa Lasuna. If you had a wooden peg, like a wooden dowel, and it's soft because it's moist, so you put it into the oven to dry out, and now it would become hard again. Chayiv mishum avashel. You're cooking the moisture inside those dowels. It'd be a chayiv bishul. Pshita, that's pashut. So you might have thought that the reason why you're doing it is only to strengthen them. And if you're only doing it to strengthen them, it means you want to get rid of the moisture. That shouldn't be cooking. Kamash Malon, the mir for Rafi, when you do cook these dowels, when you heat these dowels, first they actually soften up. So as part of the process, there's a step along the way where you want it to soften up And the melachas bishul is only because something hard softens up as you cook it. And then only add to that hadar kamet. And therefore, for the first stage of its development, that's why there's an isur bishul. Now, what's the hava meaning that there shouldn't be a problem with bishul? So the Tzafnas Paneach says that the hava meaning was that maybe bishul only applies to food items. Omer Rabba Bar Huna, Haiman the Irsach Kufra. Someone, this is relevant to Chaim Tzvi. What if someone heats up, he turns on his roofer's kettle and he cooks up tar on Shabbos? Chayiv Mishum Bashal, he's cooking the tar. Pshita, why shouldn't you be chayiv al Bashal? Ma the Taimekibin the Hadar Vi Kusha. Since the end product is when the tar hardens, I don't want it to stay in its soft state. So since that's the end, my final result that I'm looking for is that it should harden. Aim aloi, you might say that there's no din bishul on it. Kamash Malon, that there's a din bishul. Amar Rabba, Haiman the Ovid Chavisa. If someone makes a barrel on Shabbos, chayiv mishum sheva chatois, he'll be chayiv for 7 isurim. And Rashi lists off the 7 isurim that one would be chayiv for. So I'm going to read it inside. Sheva chatois, Zok Rashi. First, you start off with earth. So you take clumps of earth. You have to grind down the clumps of earth into soft sand. So that's issue number 1. Then you have to separate the stones out of the sand. Now you have boirer. Then you have umarkidin benapa. You sift the sand so it should be smooth. That's number 3. Umegabel atit, and now you mix it with water and you knead it. The hanyu losh. That's number 4. Umamarech you smear the tit. When you form the keli, you sort of smear the you're working with the clay, so you smear it around to make it into the form of a pot or of a barrel. So that's issue number 5. Should be smooth. Then you have to light up the fire in the oven to forge the keli. That's number 6. And then you put this keli that has moisture in it into the oven to forge. That's called cooking. Now, Freg Tosfos, what about when I first got to earth? I had to dig. So why am I not chayiv al schoifer? Chayuv the choifer leka then yisarchel because we said the only purpose of why you're digging is not to plant. It's because you need it's earth. Therefore, that's not one of the isurim involved. So that's the isurim involved in making a chavos. Then there's tanura. If you make an oven,
what was a chavis? A chavis is what?
A barrel. It's like a jug, like a clay jug.
A clay jug, not a. Okay, great.
Sure. Tanura. What about if you want to make an oven? Chayiv mishum shmoyne chatois. So it's the 7 that you have based on making the jug, and the extra one Rashi speaks out is the la'achar shetzarfoi bekivshan. After you put it in the oven to harden, which are all the same steps that you did for a jug. Then you toch alav tfela she'of. Then you smear a layer of mud on the outside of the oven to make the oven thick. V'chayim eskayim, and that it should retain heat better. V'hu gemar malachta, and that's the gemar malacha of an oven is when you smear that shmirchs around it. Kol midi to have a gemar malacha chayiv mishum makav patish. So Rashi, a very good kasha. The last smearing was makav patish. Well, by a chavis, you don't have that step. The last step is just putting it in the oven to forge. So let that be the makav patish. So how come I don't have makav patish by the chavis as well? Because it's the last step in the process. Zokt Rashi, an important halacha. When you put it in the oven, it becomes finished by itself. Unless you're actually doing the last thing, there is no makav patish. If the last thing happens after you put it into the oven and it starts to forge, that's not called makav patish. Makav patish is when you're doing a physical action to complete the cake. So that's a chiddush. And now we're going to learn about baskets, basket weaving. In order to explain this, I feel bad. I know we're running late, but I don't have any other way of explaining it other than showing you a video on how you weave baskets. So I have to take you to a basket weaving course. So I'm going to bring that on in 1 second. And once we
Mrs. Weaver again? Is it Mrs. Weaver?
Yeah, we're talking about. Oh, it's not Mrs. Weaver. It's another mechatenista. It's another mechatenista. We'll get to it in a second. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to bring up a video. Why isn't it taking me to where I want to go? Okay, now it's taking me to where I want to go. Go to history. Oh, it's this way. So let's see where I can find it. Here we go. How to weave a willow basket. No, that's not what I want. That's a more difficult one. I want to go to a very easy one. This is the one we're going to go to. And this will help us understand things. One second. Share a screen. Basic. Okay, here we go.
You will start weaving on the bottom. So the bottom of your basket will look like this. You will weave up the sides and then you will finish the top. So you will know the entire process of how to weave a basket. You need to start with 8 spokes about the same length.
I majored in this.
We'll separate those into 2 groups of 4.
Now the Gemara is going to compare what she's doing now to putting the chassis on the 2 beams of a loom.
You should have 2 separate groups of 4 spokes.
So as she puts these 2 sets of 4 spokes together,
you need to put those sets of spokes together so that they lay flat.
That was called, I think,
and then put one on top of the other to make a cross.
Now these have to
try
be held
and
together.
center them so that they are crossing right at the center of all the spokes. Now you're ready to start weaving, so you will need a long piece of reed called a weaver. You're going to start by putting the end of the weaver under the group that is underneath. So this group of spokes is underneath. This group of spokes is on top. You are going to start with the group that's underneath. Place the end of the weaver under one side, under all 4 spokes on that side, so that just a short tail sticks out. Then you will start weaving. It's called lashing, and you will start going around in a circle, going under over each of these sets of 4. So you're starting underneath, this is under, and then you will go over this set of 4, and then under this set of 4, under this one, over this set of 4. So that is one full rotation, under, over, under, over. You're going to do that 3 full times.
Lady, aren't you in a rush? Don't you take a kiss to carpool?
Over, under, over, under, over, under, over. So I have 3 circles going around my reed. And this is called lashing. These reeds, these spokes are lashed together. They cannot move and they are not going anywhere. Now we're going to start the actual weaving process. So we're going to start weaving
for a second.
under
this
and over. And
that she's talking about is what holds the chassis and Erev in place. That's the equivalent of putting the chassis on the 2 beams in a loom. So that's one malacha that Rashi is going to discuss specifically, the lashing. There's other people who the way they do it, instead of going around and around with the first things of weaving, what they actually did is they would cut holes in 4 of the spokes going one way, and then the other spokes they would stip into the holes. So they didn't have to weave around to hold the cross together. They actually pushed one set of reeds through the holes in the other set. And that was also lashing. But there were different methods of creating a structure to hold everything in place so you can start weaving. So that was the first step that Rashi is going to discuss. And then we get to the next step.
Separating these pieces into individual spokes. It's very important when you're weaving this type of basket that you have an odd number of spokes.
Now she started to weave.
We have 7 spokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over this one.
So basically
And
now she's just
under
going
this
under
one.
and over, and now she's actually doing the weaving process.
This one is all by himself, but I continue the same pattern. So that one goes over.
So that's enough. That's really all we needed to see. So let me get back to the Gemara. So basically, there's putting those reeds together, doing something to actually fasten them so that they should hold in place, and then you do the weaving process. So let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, if you made a basket, cholsa, man david cholsa, amar Abaye, hai man, david cholsa, chayiv achas asrei. There's 11 malachas, chatois. If you actually put a rim around the top of the basket, it would add 2 more malachas, chayiv shloishes chatois. So Rashi goes through what they are. Now that we saw the video, it's really quite simple. Chayiv Yud Aleph. Let me pull this over here. Let me make this smaller so I can see what's going on. Second. Okay, here we got it. So Zokti Rashi. Zoymer Akonim. First thing you have to do is you have to you're cutting the reeds. When you're cutting them, you're pruning the tree. So we learned earlier, Zoymer Akonim v'tzarich lehem. If you're pruning a tree, but you also need what you're cutting off for a purpose, then you're chayiv mishum koitzer. You're chayiv because you cut these reeds off because you need them. That's koitzer. Mishum neteya. You're also chayiv also neteya because by cutting those reeds off, you were pruning the tree and you improved the tree. So that you have 2 so far. Also yachad. Once you gather the reeds together that you cut, harezim ma'amar. Now you've done ma'amar, but you were gathered. Bir yafos. Then after you have your little bunch, your little pile, you're going to only pick out the good ones. Hareza boyer. That's going to be boyer. So you're at issue number 4. Hechlikam, and then you smooth them out and you scrape off anything sticking out of them. Harezim amachik, which is one of the melachas of preparing a hide. We're up to number 5. Osam dakois. Me'achashtayim oisholish. If you osam dakois me'achas shtayim oisholish, meaning you had a thicker reed, so you split it into 2 or 3 pieces. Harez toichin. Now it's like toichin. You're cutting things into very small pieces. That's number 6. Chatchan b'mida. Then you have to cut down their length to be the right length for your basket. That would be harez machatich. That's number 7. Heisech hashesi. Harez mesach. So heisech hashesi is you spread out the wheat. So when she set up those 2 sets of 4 reeds, that was setting up the shesi. Harez mesach. That was I think 8. Orag achas l'mayla v'achas l'mata. Kedei la'amidoy. When she put those first 3 loops around to hold that cross in place, so you had a solid base with which to start your weaving, that's similar, that's parallel. That's like that's the parallel of when you're putting the sheshi threads through those loops in the frames. Orag, harez orag. Once you actually start doing the weaving process, that's literally weaving. And then you have the extra spokes that are still sticking out, so you have to trim them down. And when you do the final cutting to do the final closure of the basket, that will be makabapatish, which will be number 11. If you take the threads off the gegodim to do the final touch-up, now if you wanted to make a rim, and there's a whole set of videos just on how to weave the rim that you would make around the basket. If you did that, it would add to the equation sewing, because you're in time, because you'd have to sew by stitching, not really sewing with a thread, but you're actually stitching the reeds through the top of the basket to get that rim, and then you got to tie it. You have to tie them at the end so they shouldn't fall out. So now Rashi brings up a whole important halacha. Why isn't there issur of binyan? Because you're building a basket. Rashi holds there's never an issur binyan when it comes to kalim, although Tosfos argues, so there's a big machlokes for showing him if you would be over the issur of binyan by kalim. But that's the sugya of weaving baskets. Now let's quickly finish the Gemara and then we're good to go. You shore wool and then you dye it, you whiten it. What if you're spinning wool right off the back of the animal? Normally you shear it first, you wash it first, You comb it and then you spin it. What if you spin it right off the back of the animal? And that was done actually. Chayiv sholosh chatois. She would be chayiv 3 chatois because you're doing all 3 malachas in one. Achas mishum goizes, you're shearing. V'achas mishum anapit, you're actually combing it too. The achas mishum toiva, but you happen to be doing it all in the one step. Nobody, it's not, even though it's doable, it's not the normal way to do it. Ein derech kaziza b'kach, ve'ein derech menapet b'kach, ve'ein derech tavi b'kach. Since it's not done since that's not the normal way it's done, you wouldn't be chayav chatos. It would be like a malacha that's done kala achayad. If more of a loy, is that not the way it's done? But Tanya Mishmei Reb Nechemia, shituf beizim, the tavu beizim. They in the melechas hamishkan, they did the combing and they did the spinning right off the backs of the goats. Alma tvia al gabe behema shma tvia. You see from the Floshna Pasuk that it's called tvia. If it's called tvia, so why isn't there an Isser Daraisa on Shabbos to do that malacha? The Gemara Chochma Yisei Rishayni. There was a special Chochma. The Loshna Pasuk is Tovos Izim Noso Lib V'Chal Noshem Asher Noso Libu Naisanu B'Chochma. They had a special Chochma. They were Isha Chachma slave. They had a special skill that they were blessed with, that they were able to spin it right off the backs of the sheep. And Zok Toshvis, since that's not the normal way that it's done, if you do that way, it's batal daitich etzel kol so adam, and it's not considered the normal way, even though they did it there. Now the shaila is, why in the world did they need to have such a crazy way of doing it by the Mishkan? Why couldn't they do it by the Mishkan the normal way? Let them shear the animals and do it like a mensch. Why did they have to spin it right off the backs? So the Arshko brings down from one of the Rishonim is it would make the wool was somehow, it was more beautiful. It retained its luster if it didn't go through all that process, if you just spun it right off the back. Well, when we learned the sugya once before, I don't remember, and at the time we learned the reason is because a lot of the women who were doing this spinning were nidos. And the problem is if they would cut the wool and then touch it, it would be matama the wool. By spinning it right off the backs, it avoided being matama them. So then the question is, so if they're nidos, big deal, let somebody else do it. Why did they have to do it? Find the women who aren't needed to do it. And then that the Mefarshim say is that every person has a job. Every person has a tafkid. And never would Hashem ever take away that opportunity to do their tafkid. So since it was these women's tafkid to do the tviyah, Hashem had to make it possible for them to be able to do their job. Because we're never allowed to say, well, I would have reached my full potential if. There's no such thing. Hashem always gives us all the kalim that we need to fulfill our tafkid. That's the Dvar Musar that we learn from there. Zok the Gemara, Taner about Natolich es a kanaf, vakoitmai. What if you pull off a feather from a bird? Vakoitmai, you cut off the tip. The tip is where there's only soft fibers, and you're going to use it to fill your down Canada Goose winter jacket. Or vamortoi, even along the sides of the feather where you have a thicker stem, if you just cut off the fibers, the soft portion, again, to put into your down Canada Goose jacket, chayiv sholosh chatois. You'll be chayiv 3 chatois. What are they for? Amar b'shim ben lakish, toilish, when you first pulled it off the bird, chayiv mishum goizes. By pulling a feather off a bird, you're goizes. Koitim, when you cut off the top of it, chayiv mishum echatach. Now you're cutting it down to size. Memarit, when you pull the feathers off the side, chayiv mishum machik, it's because you're scraping down the inner stem, and the inner stem is also used for things, and you're preparing that inner stem. So that's where there's 3 malachs involved in trimming a feather. Hakosher umater, someone who ties knots and someone who opens up knots. Kshira b'mishkan hecha havoi. Where did you find that they needed to tie knots in the Mishkan? Omer Rava said, shekein kosher b'yiseides lahom. The kloyim, they would blow in the wind. So they had like tent pegs in the ground, and they would have ropes that would go from the bottom of the urios to the bottom of the kloyim to the tent pegs to hold the kloyim fast. They wouldn't blow in the wind. Zok Gemara, that shouldn't be an issur at all, because ahu kosher amalas lahaterhu. The Mishkan kept on being disassembled. So when they tied that, they had a full intention of undoing that knot. And it's only a kesher shel kayama that we know has a chiyuv kshira. So that's not a good example of where you saw kshira in the Mishkan. what if I'm in the middle of weaving and one of the warp threads tear? So I have to continue the fabric. So all I do is I take another thread and I tie to it. So now that means in the fabric there'll be a knot. There'll be a knot. So that's why kshira is usher, because as part of weaving fabric, you sometimes have to make a knot when you're connecting two of the threads. Omer Rava, okay, tirat the kosher. Now you explained where you have kshira, where you have tying knots in the Beis Hamikdash, in the preparation of Mishkan. Matir Michael Memer, where do you find malacha of untying a knot? Where do you see that activity done in the Mishkan, in the preparation of the Mishkan? The chitema, the misrabele treichute kitri behade adadi shorichad v'kotachad. Imagine you have two threads that side by side had gotten cut. So because of that, you have to knot two threads that are side by side. If you have two knots side by side, imagine these threads that they wove with in the Beis Hamikdash weren't small, thin threads. They were havel shisha. There were 6 of tchelas, 6 of argaman, 6 of telashani, gold. Those sticks were more like tow truck chains. They were more like the size of chains that hold up anchors on big cruise ships. Imagine you have two knots side by side on such a beged, it's going to be a huge bump, a huge hole. It'll look bad. So because of that, what they would do is they would untie one of them, and they only left one knot. So it shouldn't be two knots side by side, so it should be a huge bulge. Frank the Gemara, how is it possible that they would have just untied one? Then it would leave a big gaping hole. Again, we're talking about huge threads, not small threads. So if you had a gap and you had two different threads that were not connected to each other, there'd be a huge hole. There's no way we would allow a fabric to be used on behalf of a king on this world with a big hole in it because the thread got stripped, got torn. They had to trap the chalazon fish because they needed the tchelas dye. And when you trap fish, you use nets, and they had to adjust the sizes of nets. So it was normal to create knots and then to undo the knots. That was part of the normal process of when they were extending the nets or making the net smaller. They had to make knots and then undo the knots, and that's where we find kshira and matirin being used as preparation for the Mishkan. Yeah.
Sorry. So if that's the use, if that's the makor of the tying, isn't that more of a tolda than an av because it's part of the other? It's being done within the trapping, or it's being done within the weaving. It's not really a malach in itself.
David Dayan asked that question. He asked, why is it that every step in the weaving, that every step of the weaving is considered its own malacha? Yet by haitzah, you look at the whole thing together, the akira, the anacha, and the halacha. How come each step is different? Because each step is a step that you have to do. And since each step is a step that has to be done, and you can't avoid it, it is an av malacha. It doesn't seem like it's as significant, because it's not the actual trapping, it's preparing the nets to trap, but the work considers that integral. But it's a good point. There's definitely a distinction. I understand the distinction that you're making. But state spheres, 2 stitches. If you just take your thread, take your needle and put it through the fabric once, then turn it over and put it through the fabric a second time, it'll fall right out. If you tie a knot at each end of the thread, even though you only went in once and then out once, the fact that they're both knotted, both edges of the thread are knotted, that will not allow the thread to pull out. I guess we'll stop here. Shkoyach. I'm sorry it took so long, but there's a lot of stuff going on today.
Thank you for the entertainment.
There's another video I want to show, but it's really running later. But let me see, what time is it? It is.
I gotta go.
It's 9 o'clock. Okay. I wanted to start showing. There's a Lubavitcher community that made a series of like 3 or 4 minute bite-sized videos on the malachas. It goes through each step very nicely. On days that we have time, it's only 3 or 4 minutes per video. I think we should go through them one by one slowly. Okay. Eventually, we'll get through them.
Akiva's not here anyway. So.
I am too.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's a very fascinating set. What it does is it actually shows a picture of the original malacha, how it was done, and then it shows pictures of things that we do nowadays that fall under that category. So it really gives us a good visual, a good understanding of what these malachas are.
And makes fabulous usage of the video visual component of the meeting, which I'm thrilled with.
Okay,
And YouTube, and you're using YouTube, even better.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the. Are you going to stop recording?
Please. Yes.
Okay, I'll stop the
Thank
recording.
you.
Thank you very much,
Have a
Rabbi
good day.
Isai.